Good morning and welcome back to the Public Service Commission. We are in the hearing concerning Duke Energy's RPs. We are in a point of commissioner questions. All commissioners are present in the hearing room. We have she's not new, but she's different court reporter this morning. And I would ask if you could go through the room and introduce yourself so that her record is adequate and she feels more comfortable. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners. I am Sam Wellborn on behalf of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. With me this morning are Brett Breitschwert of the law firm McGuire Woods and Mr. Lyle Trawick of the law firm Robinson Gray.
Thank you very much. Say CCL.
Good morning. I'm Kate Mixon on behalf of SACE, CCL, Upstate Forever, and Vote Solar. And with me virtually are Emma Clancy and Thomas Gooding.
Thank you. Sierra Club.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Robert Guild, and with me virtually is Dory Jaffe for Sierra Club. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolina Clean Energy Business Association.
Chair Powers, Richard Witt for SECEBA. Also representing SECEBA is SECEBA's General Counsel, John Burns. He is participating virtually.
I see him on the screen.
Okay.
Welcome to all of you who are virtual. Office of Regulatory Staff.
Good morning, Chair Powers, Vice Chair Williams, and members of the Commission. Donna Rainey on behalf of ORS. And with me today is Chad Torrey and Joshua Austin.
And Walmart, Ms. Eaton, you are virtual today, is that correct? Stephanie Eaton?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, if there's nothing else, we are ready to proceed with Commissioner questions. Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I have just a few questions, and the first one's for you, Ms. Bateman. So yesterday you talked about the potential framework if one state decided to opt in or opt out of an asset. And looking at your rebuttal testimony on page 5, and you don't need to pull it out, but you say a framework could be developed that allows each state to decide up front whether or not to participate in a specific new generation resources. And the upfront is, you want to elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, I think that's before significant construction work begins on a facility, before significant investments are made. The states, and really what I'm trying to say is that we can develop a framework to accommodate differences in the resource portfolios. And so, for example, if this commission approves a most reasonable and prudent resource plan based on what's known at this time, and the North Carolina approves a different one for the dual state system, then we have an issue because South Carolina is about 20% of those resources in the portfolio, and North Carolina is about 80%. And if there's a divergence, then we need a way to accommodate that. And so I think we could have a decision up front before significant investments are made about what states want to participate in which resources and how do we accommodate that divergence in the portfolios.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that there was nothing that needs to be decided in this IRP proceeding that says South Carolina's going to be in or out of something. And
yes, I understand that. I would say I don't think we're making, nothing is determinative in this proceeding or in this order, but we are laying out a plan that we believe is most reasonable and prudent. And if this commission agrees that that plan is most reasonable and prudent to pursue based on the information known at this time, and then we reasonably and prudently execute on that plan and reasonably and prudently adjust to changes in circumstances that develop after that point, then I think it would be, I would expect if the utility acts reasonably and prudently, that we have an opportunity to recover our reasonable and prudent costs from customers in a future rate case proceeding or rider proceeding. So I don't know if that, it's not predetermination, not pre-approval, but it is a, I would expect that we come out of this proceeding with an idea of what the commission believes is the most reasonable and prudent plan for South Carolina customers, given the information known at this time.
Okay. And basically, I think what I heard you say is even at that point, we still have to go through all of the other steps and processes.
I would just underscore nothing about the framework that Ms. Bateman is referring to relieves the company of demonstrating that its expenses were reasonably and prudently incurred in a rate case.
Okay. All right. So let's see. And that brings me to a question for you, Ms. Smith. So there's been a lot of talk about the different elements that come into play, the IRP, the CPRE, and the Siting Act. And we've talked about this a good bit with various people. And one of the witnesses was Mr. Snyder. And basically, so my question for you is that if we have an asset that's included in the IRP and it's selected in a CPRE filing, is there enough evidence in the record in this case to bypass any requirements of the Siting Act?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. So I have one more question for you. Yesterday, I think I heard you say something, maybe I didn't. We'll have a transcript later, but I just want to see if I got this straight. I think I heard you say we are not the decision makers as to what is in our plan. Pretty sure I heard you say that.
If I said it exactly that way, then I misspoke. We are not the decision makers of what is the most reasonable and prudent plan to be determined by the commission at this time. The operative legislation puts y'all, in our view, in the role of decision maker as to what is the most reasonable and prudent plan for South Carolina. It will be, we're the decision maker on how we execute from the date of that order, but in that order, y'all are certainly the decision maker, and we will rely upon that order and take that order into account as we make decisions and take actions after the date of the order.
Okay. And the company is the decision maker as to what is in the plan that is before us, correct?
Sort of. And the reason I say that is there is a lot of direction in the IRP statute about what different scenarios and comparisons are included in the IRP. So in many ways, the General Assembly has been a decision maker about what is included in our filings. Our decisions are influenced by stakeholder engagement and the different models and different input assumptions that come into play. So we are the decision maker, but we take those views very seriously through stakeholder engagement. And then I do think there is a disconnect because there's been a lot of talk in this hearing about what is the company's decision-making obligation. And I think we've been transparent that we own our decisions on what to do and how to interpret the commission's order. But that independent business judgment on what to do the day after an order comes out is not necessarily, it's not, that independent discretion is not necessarily given the same credence when we look at our input assumptions. There's been a number of input assumptions or constraints that have been criticized in this proceeding where we should, and it's my words, not others, but where we should potentially ignore our coal retirement schedules, or where we should ignore our judgment on what is a reasonable solar generic cost assumption, or what is our judgment and our experts' judgment on what is a reasonable path to new nuclear. So while it is the company's decision as to what to put forth as a recommended portfolio, there are a number of inputs that are influenced either through stakeholder engagement or through the Commission's prior orders when it comes to the inputs to the models that are used.
All right, thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Any further questions? Commissioner Carolee Williams, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Appreciate your being here and the ability to ask some questions. Some of them will not be any surprise. So, Ms. Smith, I'm going to start with thinking about out loud the IRP process and the updates and the comprehensive IRP going forward. Is there any agreement at this point, given that it is September, I think, of 2024, and the original filing was in August of 2023 for a comprehensive update?
A comprehensive IRP, in my mind, the at least every 3-year time frame, in my mind, would run August of 2026.
Okay.
I'm sorry, let me count that right. 27, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, 3 years. So, in our view, it would run 3 years after we filed.
But you filed in, well.
Sorry, 4, 5, 6, sorry. Yeah, I need to get my calculator
I
here. So
understand.
3 years from
Believe me.
August 2023, August 2026 is when we would think that 3 years would run. If circumstances require us to file earlier and the Commission gives us leave to do so, then we could certainly do that, and there may be circumstances where we want to do that. If the world changes, we may seek relief to come to you before that time frame. I think Commissioner Belzer also had referenced the 2-year cycle.
Right.
That we have in North Carolina. So I think we're pretty flexible. It says at least every
Right.
3 years, and so there may be benefit to us coming more frequently, as well as we put a lot of time and attention into our IRP updates and making
Right.
those as informative as possible for the Commission.
Well, where I'm coming from is, personally, I can't see any value in a 2024 update. It just feels like it would be stale by the time we got it, after we produce our order. So what I talked with Mr. Snyder about was the idea of you all, with your stakeholders, talking about what is a logical update and then a logical time frame for a comprehensive IRP, as well as considering the circumstance you have with joint filings with North Carolina, and then coming back to us with a late filed exhibit, which others in this room would have to define, when that would need to be produced by. But I don't see how we can create an order with, at least in the fashion that we have had orders in the past for IRPs, that recognize the timing of improvements, and some that can need to be sooner and some that can wait for the IRP, the comprehensive IRP. Does that make sense to you? Are you all willing to work with?
Absolutely, and it does make sense to know what comes next. I would also say that in the time period that we're talking about, whether it's an update in 2025 and a comprehensive in 26, got that one right, or something more frequent, we have agreed to a number of updates on things, either with the ORS or with the Commission, on where we are on economic development load. And there's been a lot of talk about economic development load, but there's also a ton of organic, natural, traditional load growth with how fast South Carolina's growing. We got 30,000 new customers just since this proceeding started. So, I don't want to forget that pocket of growth, as well as the results of a lot of the ongoing evaluations that we're doing. There's been a talk of a commitment that we've made on our continued, price discovery and cost estimates, and a continued evaluation related to Bad Creek, and a variety of things like that. So it is not my intent in the chair that I sit in for y'all to have to wait for that information until a comprehensive IRP in 2026, regardless of what the schedule turns out to be.
Chair Powers, can we reserve a exhibit number for a late filed exhibit?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question before we do that?
Certainly, I know we're on a timeline.
Well, I'm just concerned about with what Commissioner Williams is asking for, is that something that can be accomplished? I mean, to talk to the stakeholders and get back, I just don't know that we need a late filed exhibit. I'm wondering if it's just additional correspondence that needs to come in or be addressed somehow separately as far as a scheduling type order or something, because I mean, we've got to close this record and get a decision. Is that working with the stakeholders on what is being asked? Is that something that can be accomplished in a week or two?
I think the company's view can definitely be accomplished. I think we've already started having some of those conversations, not fully formed. And I would also think Mr. Welburn might be a little bit closer to that, to those scheduling and procedural issues. And I don't know if he can address those through a letter.
Let me add one clarifying point. I said stakeholders, but I really mean interveners. I mean, because you all are the ones who have, I think the interveners and the company can determine that together. Does that help at all to fine tune it that way?
It does. That's a universe that we've been able to work through lots of scheduling issues, even in this case.
Do you feel it's doable in the time frame that we would need it as a late filed exhibit? I don't see how we can write an order without this information.
It seems doable to me. I don't know, maybe at the close of hearing, if you would invite that same question from counsel, who I think might have been having some of these discussions from a procedural aspect.
And to me, whether it's a late filed exhibit or correspondence that we can review and look at, either way works for me. But
well, the correspondence if it's going to be correspondence, it still needs to be a hearing exhibit, because the hearing record is separate from what's on DMS.
Right.
And we have to base our decision on the hearing record.
What about this? I mean, what we're asking for is an attempt and a letter as a late filed exhibit that tells us what you were able to achieve, attempts to do that. And if you're able to work it out and with the interveners and you've got a schedule that makes sense, we'll have that. And if you're not, that will be the late filed exhibit.
Yes, that's certainly fine with the company.
Commissioner Williams, with all due respect, that any sort of late file exhibit like that, it doesn't give parties the right to cross-examination. I mean, we've got to close this docket and issue an order within a certain time frame. I'm not sure if you could lay out a little more about exactly what you're asking for. I don't know that I understand.
Okay. What I would suggest would be helpful to me as a commissioner is to know what the parties believe is the most appropriate time within 3 years to create the timeline for the next comprehensive comprehensive plan. And that could include your evaluation of whether it is timed coincident with North Carolina's comprehensive plan. And then from that, you would identify what updates are logical between now and then. And, you know, it could be a replication of what we've been doing. It could be that there's a year that we just don't have an update. But that's, in my opinion, for you all to define.
Commissioner Williams,
Yes.
if I may, just for what it's worth, the statute dictates when. I think I understand what you're asking. What I'm wondering if it would, at present, maybe just be best to follow the statute requirements and guidelines, knowing that it may not be ideal, but it's functional.
Chair Powers, I have a little more information that maybe helps, maybe doesn't, if I may.
Help, yes.
Thank you, sir. In docket number 2005-83-A, among other dockets, Counsel for ORS has filed a proposed schedule that the companies previously agreed to that would have the companies file their next comprehensive IRP on July 1st, 2026. Again, I don't think that's been filed in this docket, but I believe the commission could potentially take, or the chair could take judicial notice of that docket to the extent helpful on this particular issue.
I don't have it in front of me, but certainly will take judicial notice that that's.
Mr. Chairman, and that's why I'm wondering if this is more of a procedural schedule type issue that can be addressed outside of this this hearing. The clerk has convened some sort of session with, I don't know if it was advisory committee or what, but there has been some correspondence going back and forth, is my understanding, regarding some scheduling. And I would note, and I know the timeline has gotten pushed out because of the update, but I mean, the statute says that the utility shall file an annual update. And maybe want the next update, because we're in this we've been pushed out a little bit. Maybe the next update is not as robust as the following update may be. But I just think we need to. I don't. Anyway, I just point those out.
Thank you, Commissioner Belser. Also, with the statutory requirements, I don't see how we can tie it to when or what North Carolina does. Commissioner Williams.
Well, we do have the flexibility that the statute says at least every 3 years. And so that, I think that allows, but I'm not trying to dictate that. I'm just, and I'm not aware of the conversations that our clerk may have already had regarding, because the way I look at it, you filed in August of 2023. Is the company working on a 2024 update?
I think I can help here. In D1 of the IRP statute, it talks about an annual update must include an update to the electric utilities base planning assumptions relative to its most recently accepted IRP. And so the way I read that is that we need an IRP to come out of this proceeding to know what it is that we're going to update. And if the company finds cause to file that update earlier because it wants to bring additional information up to the commission, I don't think that a earlier update is precluded. But what are we updating? We're updating the accepted plan, which I think will come out of this docket. That's just my view of looking at D1 to the degree that that's helpful.
And would that give you all the flexibility to not file a 2024 update?
I think that would give us the flexibility to not file that, but I also, would like to make sure, as we will at all times, that there's nothing that we feel like we need to bring to the commission's attention. So I would never want to say that we wouldn't file something earlier if we felt like it was our duty to, much like we updated in this case, the load forecast. We felt that was our duty to, it did wreak havoc with this schedule, but we felt like that was the right thing to do.
And that's the primary reason I'm bringing this up, so that we understand in our order if there's things that need to happen next, how we will term that, so that you understand this is the 2024 update, this is for the 2025 update, and this is for the 2026 comprehend. I mean, that's traditionally what we would have done. So that, I don't know if that helps to clarify the conundrum I think we have in order writing. But
Commissioner,
I actually was gonna ask her, for her to elaborate on something earlier. I wasn't planning on any of this discussion. You know, my inclination is keep it simple and let's just follow the law, and then if anything deviates, handle it then. And, you know, look at the.
Commissioner Williams, I think the statute's pretty clear. It says shall submit annual updates. Even though this one is running late by a significant amount of time, even the annual update says we've just submitted the other and just have our order. We have no updates to make. It would be an update. I don't think we can do what you're asking
Okay.
the company to do. So I don't think I can grant what you're asking for at this time.
Thank you. Commissioner Caston, do you need to ask a question? I have more to ask, but if it's related to what you heard.
Yes,
Okay.
a clarification, just the 30,000 new customers, and I can't remember if that was the same thing as yesterday, but I think it's the same thing, and that was, did I understand that 30,000 new customers was since the filing of the original 2023 IRP?
Since the customer count we used for the original filing. So when we made our filing in August of 2023, we were around 4.5 million customers. And as of August of 2024, we're at 4.675 million customers. And so, of course, I wanted to know how many of those were in South Carolina. And so we have, when we filed this case, we had reported around 820,000 customers in South Carolina. As of August 2024, my information is that we're now at 853,000 customers. So we have had organic growth.
So that math is 30,000, because I didn't catch it real.
33, I rounded.
South Carolina. And that's residential service connections? Is that what that is? Or
That
is
would be, that would,
industrial, commercial?
that would be all accounts.
All accounts. And the population growth, as I recall, was about, is that still the 1.8%? Is that related to that 1.8% population growth, 1.8% of?
Yes, I think that is some
5
of that, where, you mean, are you referring to the U.S. Census that South Carolina had?
Well, and what was in the IRP?
Yes. I mean, we are seeing the growth that we reported in our update in January, and those numbers are corroborative of that growth.
I don't doubt that, but, and I probably should have asked someone earlier, because I want to, you know, fully, to the best of my ability, understand the numbers, the 1.8%. And I think in the IRP, it had the number of residential customers and then projected out, I think, 6,000 something. And,
I just don't have that with me, sir.
okay. Then I have no more questions.
That's what you call drop the mic. Commissioner Williams, you.
Thank you, Chair
Commissioner
Powers.
Williams,
Ms.
thank you.
Bateman, you testified yesterday to $1 billion in savings or benefits to customers in the 2 states. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that. My particular question is that spread out over the 12 years generally equally, or did some of it happen, more initially? Those are where my thoughts went.
Yes, so I don't have it exactly by year, and there were two times that I mentioned the over $1 billion.
Right.
So The first one was related to the joint dispatch agreement, and that was from 2012 when it was approved through 2024. So over $1 billion. I know in the first 5 years of that agreement, we had committed to a certain amount of savings for customers, and we reached that. And so I do think it's pretty spread over that 12-year period. It would be more in times of higher fuel costs, so it would fluctuate from year to year. But so I don't have it exactly by year, but it is across the full 12 years. And we would expect, so the second $1 billion that I talked about was the merger.
Right.
So we're achieving a certain amount of savings through the joint dispatch agreement, but we think a full merger of the two utilities would achieve even greater savings. And our preliminary results have that at over $1 billion over 12 years. And so we're targeting that merger in January 1st, 2027. We would expect that we would file an application with this commission sometime next year, and we would have a more fulsome analysis of those savings. So it would be from 2027, beginning of 2027 through the end of 2038 is the time period over which we would show those savings to align with this IRP proceeding. So we would expect to file that sometime next year, and it would be $1 billion on top of the savings that are already being achieved through the joint dispatch agreement. And so I think we would have more information to share with the commission next year. I think we also intend to work with stakeholders between now and that filing to reach consensus, where we can reach consensus before we file a proposal with this commission.
And just a couple of additional things there. Earlier in the proceeding, Commissioner Thomas had asked whether we would be, if I understood the request or the question, if we would be amenable to having a docket at the commission. We would be happy to have a merger, maybe an NDI docket, to lodge our, stakeholder information, and that there is, something out there that people can go to. So we would have no objection to that if that is the direction the commission would like to go. The other thing I wanted to underscore is, unlike prior mergers where we had duplication, yesterday I talked about, 2 different corporate reporting functions, 2 different SEC groups, that kind of thing. There's only one of Mr. Callahan. There's certainly only one of Ms. Bateman. And so that type of duplication are not the source of the savings from the merger. The predominant savings would be, and other witnesses testified to this, but and it's in our filing. But really, we need less. It takes us less resources to meet our reserve margin. So if we are a combined company, we have to build less resources to meet our reserve margin. So that's the source of the savings versus the corporate consolidation that we saw in other things. The other thing that you had asked Commissioner Williams yesterday was whether the question was going to whether there had been a quantification of as I heard it, the value of the dual state system. And I don't have this with me, but we had asked that question, and we had looked at the value of the dual state system to South Carolina, and our results are the total contribution of Duke Energy is around $7.6 billion annually, but the piece of that directly relates to the dual state system is around $1.5 billion annually. When you consider all the resources and all the investment we have in South Carolina, that also goes to serve both states. From a South Carolina perspective alone, there would be no reason for us to have the kind of investment that we have in the state. When you look at the multiple nuclear plants, Bad Creek, et cetera, we would not have been able to do those kinds of things on South Carolina load alone.
Thank you very much. You anticipated the next question and more. Ms. Smith, I want to go back to the conversation you had with Commissioner Belzer, and I just want to be clear about what I think I heard. that with regard to the Siting Act's requirement for generation cost comparisons, that the IRP would not serve to do that?
I think it will depend upon each case. So the Siting Act requires that there is a comparison of generation options. I think what that comparison is will need to depend upon what is the distance from the IRP. Are we 3 years away? Or are we 2 months away? Were the cost estimates in the IRP consistent with what we're seeing in the market? What are we comparing it to? Is it light resources? So like Mr. Snyder said, and I think everyone's agreed that the IRP is an important component in the Siting Act, but I think there can certainly be additional points of information that could go to that comparison of other generation prong. But I think it'll just depend on what it is that's getting cited, or what is being up to be considered for being cited.
Thank you. Either of you can answer this, but does the company consider at all what kind of profit it can make when it looks at generation sources?
No. And I've heard Mr. Snyder say that before on the stand, and that's why I can confidently say that when the modeling team is looking at their models and running their resource plans, they do not look at, earnings for the company. They look at present value of revenue requirements and executability and reliability and all of the things that Mr. Snyder talked about.
I will say when it's time for someone like Mr. Bauer, or who y'all saw in the rate case, or our Treasury group to work with our construction group, and when we go out and raise funds to do the things that are necessary to serve customers, we very much consider our ability to invest and to attract investment, to raise the dollars to do the things that we need to do to make sure we have enough capital to do the things that we need to do as we look to add resources. So that's more of it definitely comes into play, but that's more of where that comes into play.
So you're saying you look at the IRP as a resource, particularly, I'm putting words in your mouth, but particularly ones that are approved when you're going to look for capital as evidence of a direction that you're going in.
Certainly our investors do. We get a lot of questions about where the state is on particular generation resources, what's our IRP. We get that from customers too, who want to know what their generation mix is going to be serving them as they consider if they're going to expand, or if they're going to locate, or some of the actions that they may need to take on their own to meet their individual goals.
Okay. I had a discussion with someone, and I meant to look at the code, but it was related to kind of the attitude that IRPs and what is included in them, are based on the statute, but they evolve in terms of generation and in terms of information. But what I wanted to give you all a chance to respond to is the role of transmission planning associated with generation planning, and where we might, where you see that going in the future.
I'll take the first stab of that.
And the reference I was making to the statute was the fact that it does, give us the ability to require some elements of transmission planning, and not that you have not done some of that, but I just wanted to give you a big picture time to talk about that.
Yeah. So a lot of, and Mr. Roberts talked about this a good bit, but a lot of what we're required to do from a transmission perspective is squarely within FERC. And so much like the post office, much like the postal system is interstate commerce, because once you put it in, put a letter in the box, it can cross state lines. The transmission system is exactly the same way. So when Mr. Roberts was talking about the different transmission planning collaboratives, Those are driven by FERC order because FERC has those bulk power transmission responsibilities. We also have an open access transmission tariff system. We have transmission rates that are set by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so I think there has been a desire to see what that looks like and to understand what our transmission planning objectives are and how that is transpiring. Mr. Roberts also talked about the multi-value planning initiative that has been undertaken, and that's part of that overall process. The commission, we come before this commission to cite a transmission line. This commission has the authority to make siting decisions about where those transmission lines go. But also transmission, none of the generation is gonna work unless it can get to where it needs to go. And so transmission does play a key role in our overall integrated plan because that is an enabling factor for generation to get where it needs to go. So the purpose of transmission, as I think of it from an IRP, is not siting. That comes up in Siting Act cases, but more about do you have the transmission enabled for these generation sources that are being proposed and contemplated in an IRP, or do you have the plans and wherewithal to construct them? So that's how I think about it. Notwithstanding that, we filed significantly more transmission information in this IRP than we did the 2020 IRP. Mm-hmm. So, and we were compliant in 2020. We believe we were compliant when we filed this IRP, but we were also amenable to including more information. And there had been a recommendation made there, and I understand and heard Mr. Roberts be amenable to that as it pertains to planned projects. I hope I answered your question.
You did. And what about distribution resource planning and integrated system operations?
We actually have an ISOP chapter in the IRP. It escapes me. I knew it this morning because I heard you talking about it the other day, and that penguin left my iceberg. I just cannot remember it. So we have a chapter on integrated, our ISOP activities, and we actually have done studies with that or participated in studies with that. I think we're the only utility in South Carolina, as far as I know, to use ISOP, but it is marrying and getting the most and the best out of the grid as we look at a variety of different resources.
Thank you. I wondered if, as you listened to this proceeding and you thought about the near-term action plan and some of the conversations that have happened about, understanding what you're exactly asking for, whether there are new terms that would make it easier to communicate what it is you're asking for. And what I think about is, I've heard the term at some point in this proceeding, shopping list. Ms. Smith, you referred to the plan as a guide. In my world, in approvals with city government, there was sometimes a conceptual approval before there was a final approval. Do you think there's an opportunity to fine-tune language that may make exactly what you're asking for clearer?
Yes, I think we've learned a lot from this proceeding about maybe how to phrase things. I don't think our request is any different than what other utilities have gotten, but I think maybe because it's us, it's a little more complicated, and because we're in a dual state system. So I do think we have some opportunities to take some lessons learned from how we phrase things and how we explain things. I know when I was listening to Mr. Salter, I felt like we were saying a lot of the same things. I also think stakeholder engagement is a really good opportunity to work through some of that. But I do think we, have some opportunity. We got some homework in the last case. I suspect we'll get some more out of this case, and we'll continue getting better and being transparent.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I've said this before, my concern came in with the ORS testimony about this resource plan may have incremental costs due to North Carolina law. And so that kind of perked my ears up, and we don't want to get into a situation where we invest, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, and get to a rate case proceeding, and then hear that resource plan was driven by North Carolina law, and therefore we're going to disallow some of these costs. I think, from my perspective, we're looking for exactly the same thing that the other utilities in South Carolina are looking for. What is the best plan for South Carolina customers based on South Carolina law without any regard to North Carolina law? And we believe it's P3 fall base. But if that's not the case and P3 fall base has incremental costs solely due to North Carolina law, then we need to pivot and we need to adjust.
Thank you. Ms. Bateman, my last question's for you. You probably heard me talk a little bit about the desire to see more of the IRP be focused on South Carolina numbers and understanding dual state. But do you think once the merger's in place and you're not having to track as much depth numbers that we might get to a point where there's a that there could be more differentiation in what South Carolina needs?
So I'll talk about that maybe from two perspectives, and then I would invite Ms. Smith to add if she has anything to add. So when you say South Carolina numbers, I know we do present system numbers, and that $1 billion that I talked about, that's a system number. And so in general, South Carolina is about 20% of the system. So South Carolina is about 20% of the retail system. And if you include South Carolina retail and wholesale together, South Carolina is about 20% of the total system. So we could, represent the numbers as on a South Carolina basis and just show 20% of this resource in this year, but it's 20% of a dual state system resource. So that might be, I don't know if that is what you're asking for. However, if what you're asking for is let's do a resource plan just to serve the needs of South Carolina, that's where I think we would lose a lot of those efficiencies and economies of scale that we get when South Carolina is 20% of the larger system. And so I think we can accommodate either. I think the second one, you lose savings for customers.
And I think you probably picked up on the struggle I was having as I was asking it.
But I get the concern. I mean, and I think, we learned a lot in the last IRP before the commission. We're learning a lot in this one, and I suspect we'll keep at it. This is only the second comprehensive IRP proceeding that we've had, certainly not as a company, but in South Carolina. Right. And so I was thumbing through the IRP last night, and I saw a lot of opportunities to break out South Carolina specific information in a way that we have not before because the IRP plans for the system. I was looking at batteries and some of our plans for batteries, but it wasn't clear it wasn't clear what state they were going in. And so when I think about our descriptions of growth, even our conversation, this morning about population growth, I do think we have more opportunities to provide additional South Carolina specifics in addition to the system numbers. And so, I have sensed some frustration on that over the last 2 weeks, and I think that is an area we can look at providing additional South Carolina specifics to provide color to the system numbers that we're seeing. As to also your concern with sort of nomenclature and what we call things, I think one of the things that you know, a girl can dream, but one of the places I would like to get to is if we develop different nomenclature in South Carolina, and there may be very good reasons for that, if we're doing something very similar in North Carolina and it's called something else, that's not a reason, I think, to raise a red flag. You know, for example, I didn't get a chance to look at the order very long that Mr. Torrey gave me yesterday from the North Carolina case. And to be honest, I went back and sort of looked at it last night because I kept wondering, you know, there was a reason this was introduced, and I was trying to understand that a little bit more. But then I started reading it and thought, gosh, there's some really good stuff in here. And so when I go through the ordering paragraphs on page 131 of that order, paragraph 3, I thought about the allegation that we're trying to imprint North Carolina law into South Carolina, and we're not. But when I look at ordering paragraph 3, it talks about reducing carbon dioxide emitted by the electric generating facility sited within North Carolina. So even in that order, there is a recognition that that 951 applies to facilities in North Carolina. I also looked at ordering paragraphs 12 through 15, where there's a lot of discussion where the North Carolina Commission wanted us to continue pursuing second license renewal for nuclear plants. That's certainly something we have in common. Where the North Carolina Commission wanted us to pursue or ordered us to pursue expansion of flexibility at our existing natural gas fleet. That's something that works, is of interest to both states. And that 15 talks about including realistic assumptions on the availability of firm natural gas transportation capacity. Well, North Carolina ordered it, but it's the right thing to do anyway. And so that's one of the things that Mr. Mitchell was sitting here talking about. And the same thing for paragraph 8. When I look at some of these other paragraphs, I'm looking particularly at 23 through 28. It talks about stakeholder engagement and additional information for offshore wind, which I think is of interest to both states before we jump in with both feet. I look at near-term actions for small modular and advanced nuclear. So those are the exact same things when I look at the breadth of statutes in South Carolina, when I look at the energy policy statute that talks about nuclear development and nuclear being included in emissions plans. It's in my testimony. I talk about it a good bit. But that's consistent with what we find in South Carolina. When I look at paragraph 26, this is about wind, where there's direction for us to consider each of the 3 currently available wind energy areas off the coast of North Carolina. That's again looking very carefully before we jump in with both feet. And Mr. McIntyre was here talking about offshore wind, and I sensed some frustration because he couldn't answer a lot of questions about the lease held by the unregulated affiliate. And there is a firewall between us as regulated employees and unregulated affiliates, and that's a very careful thing that we take very seriously. So because you don't want to influence the outcome of that analysis. So he wasn't being evasive, nor am I. We're just not a part of that unregulated affiliate, so I don't know a lot about that part either. That's where the discovery and the evaluation makes sense. I look at paragraph 27 that we're supposed to investigate and pursue any federal funding that is available through the IIJA or IRA. That sounds very consistent with what South Carolina wants us to do. And I got a little concerned with questions about our new nuclear group because I don't know how we evaluate new nuclear, and I don't know how to answer the phone when DOE calls wanting to talk about financial opportunities for new nuclear without somebody at Duke on the other line being designated to talk about new nuclear. So I get a little concerned there, but I do see the direction being consistent. Paragraph 28 talks about a focus on EE, and that we provide a range of modeling scenarios for our EE assumptions, which are very aggressive, which we talked about and Mr. Duff talked about earlier in the case. So all of these things, to me, don't necessarily have an exact statutory corollary in South Carolina, but when I look at the breadth of South Carolina statutes and when I look at the balancing factors, I think of it at a in pari materia type of concept, looking at all of it as a whole. I see a lot of commonality. Whether there's enough commonality, of course, will be up to the commission. But I do hope as we think about different nomenclature and ways that we can maybe make our case clearer and better. You know, this is the first time we've provided a South Carolina chapter. You know, that's, I hope, one improvement, but we'll continue to think on that. But, you know, we may wind up calling things different names in different states, but I just don't want that to turn into a gotcha moment when there are very good reasons to pursue similar objectives, even if they're called or motivated by different things.
Ms. Smith and Ms. Bateman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Ms. Smith, did you sleep at all last night?
I slept great. I didn't have to talk to a single attorney last night. I slept great.
We have just a few more questions. And I'm thinking if it is required to do a 2024 update, maybe that could just be something as simple as addressing the stakeholder meetings or giving the South Carolina numbers. We don't have to have a hearing every time we get an update. We have a right to accept it as information. So that's something, I guess, to keep in the back of mind.
I do think, sir, some clarity on what we're updating would be good. The statute talks about updating the accepted IRP, so it would be good for us to know, you know, what exactly we're updating. Is it, you know, is it the outcome of this docket or that kind of thing?
It's got to be approved first. So
exactly, sir.
For you to know. So
exactly.
That's just something I was thinking out loud. Commissioner Thomas and then Commissioner Caston.
Can I just ask a question? Following up on what she just said, real quick.
Okay, this is like Vice Chair Williams. I'm sorry.
I yield to the past chair.
No, I mean, the update statute does list some things that are supposed to be addressed in the update, correct?
Yes.
I mean, to me, it just depends on how robust it is or needs to be, or, you know, the changes. And there may not be that many, or there may be a lot. We don't know.
That's exactly right. We'll need time to do an update to meet the statutory requirements, and the order will be informative.
I just don't want that to get lost, that the statute specifies certain areas that need to be addressed in the update.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, sir. Ladies, I want to go through a little exercise with you before we let you all go, just to make sure I understand all the options that are available to us based on the way you see it. And just to give you an example of what I'm looking for, I grew up in a little country church with wooden floors with very charismatic people. And it was rare that they ever talked about heaven without also talking about hell. And so as a child, I knew my options. And it was easy to pick which way I wanted to go based on the way they decided to deliver that information. Not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong, but as a child, they made it very clear. You all seem to be offering what you believe is best for your system. You've made that very clear. But what you've also made clear is that the decision is ours. What I am trying to wrap my head around is what would happen for South Carolina ratepayers in the event that this commission decides that P0 is the most reasonable and prudent means of providing generation and capacity. But then our neighbors to the north decide that P3 is the best for them, and they decide to invest in SMRs, and they decide to invest in wind, and we decide that we want to go gas heavy. what could that look like for South Carolina ratepayers?
First of all, I think that could be incredibly risky for South Carolina because that assumes a whole lot of natural gas could be built that our experts who are responsible for ensuring gas supply and building gas units said was unexecutable. So I think that could put us in a position where South Carolina could be relying on resources that cannot come to fruition. So I think that's one thing. And so I think the other thing is we could see some incredibly volatile fuel swings. If we are that heavily concentrated in natural gas, we just 2 years ago, we had some really steep fuel increases because there were changes in commodity pricing. And so then I think we would be facing a lot of commodity price risk for customers. I think the other thing is we could see an impact to economic development because no one is asking for more carbon in our energy mix when it comes to economic development. A lot of our customers appreciate the nuclear resources we have and are very interested in carbon-free additional resources because it helps meet their sustainability goals. We're sitting here, it's Clean Energy Week in South Carolina. Government Master deemed it Clean Energy Week here in South Carolina. And so a lot of the companies that are locating here and bringing jobs and tax base are very interested in clean energy. I think the other thing that we could see is a lack of RECs available, those renewable energy certificates that customers rely upon or are interested in relying upon, where we're taking our solar energy called for by the plan as necessary and then peeling off those frequent flyer miles of renewable energy certificates that companies can use for their sustainability goals. Those would primarily go to North Carolina companies, not South Carolina companies. And then I think we would all probably have a lot of questions to answer because everything that I just outlined is wholly inconsistent with the balancing factors under the IRP statute.
And so I would just add to that. I think my co-panelist, you introduced your question as similar to a choice between heaven and hell, and she may have outlined, how appropriate that analogy is. But if this commission were to select P0 or one of the other portfolios in this that we've presented in this case that is not P3 fall base, and the North Carolina Commission selects P3 fall base, there's a divergence in the resource mix between the two states. I think that's where we begin, kind of the next step is we begin to develop that framework that I discussed in my testimony. And once we develop that framework, then we can run analysis on what that looks like. If there's maybe a little bit, we would have maybe North Carolina only resources, joint resources, and potentially South Carolina only resources in the plan. And we could run bill impacts based on that and present information to this commission. But I think that's, if there is a divergence, I think that's the next step, is developing that framework that allows for the divergence.
And in that analogy of heaven and hell, we just don't want to be in purgatory. I choose heaven over hell, but what we really are concerned about is being in purgatory and not having a path. We think we've laid out the right path under South Carolina policy and law in P3 fall base. But if the commission does not agree, we just want enough direction and guidance so that we know what comes next so that we're not in purgatory.
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. What is concerning to me is that I could see a world where if, let's just say, the North Carolina Commission goes along with or approves P3, and let's just say it works, everything works the way you say that, or you think it will work. The future that you offer is the future that comes to be. The SMRs are humming. The wind turbines are turning. And then we're heavily reliant on gas, and some catastrophic world event occurs and there's a problem. we're sort of looking to the north and like, that looks a whole lot better now than it did before. And I'm not really sure there'll be much we could do about it at that point. All right, I think that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Mr. Cass.
Follow up. Actually, we'll get back to that in a minute, but the merger, when we were talking about the DEC-DEP merger, it's maybe been discussed and I just missed it, but thinking about if the merger occurs, when it occurs, how it occurs. Presently, as I understand it, there's DEC, as I understand it, has an inclining block rate. DEP has a declining block rate. Currently, DEP's rates, I think residential, and I assume the commercial industrial, are higher than the DEC. So, and you may not have the answer for any of that, but I thought about those things. So when this merger occurs, those things also seem to, are going to need to be, I would assume, merged.
So I think that's an excellent question. So when I talk about the merger of the utilities, it's a consolidation. I mean, in some senses, it's an internal reorganization. It's a consolidation of the two regulated utility entities or subsidiaries. What happens on January 1st, 2027, if everything is approved, is a consolidation of those legal entities. We also get to achieve some of the operational efficiencies by having, single unit commitment, joint planning, things like that. What won't change on, 1/1/27 is the rate schedules. So we would, on legal day one, we would continue to have rate schedules available for legacy DEC customers and rate schedules available to customers in the legacy DEP service territory. And then from that point, after legal day one, we would slowly merge and consolidate those rate schedules over time in subsequent rider and rate case proceedings. And that's one of the things we would be working with stakeholders between now and when we file the merger application to flesh out a little bit more what that looks like. And then we would expect to include a plan in that merger application for how we would do that, if that makes sense.
It does, but, thinking that there is that rate differential and the other things, and that the merger, as we've been told, and I have no reason to doubt it, is in the best interest of the state, the company, and it just makes more sense all the way around. But with those distinctions, there may be concern that, okay, and you don't, well, if you can't answer it, maybe you already know, but customers living in DEC is probably not going to want their rates to go up because DEPs are higher.
Yes, we are very cognizant of impacts to individual customers from rate changes and rate schedule changes and things of that nature. And so we would employ, like we do in rate cases, principles of gradualism along with parity. And Witness Reed talks about these items in rate cases, but we would employ principles of gradualism as we look at combining rate schedules. We could grandfather customers on existing rate schedules and just close them to new rate schedules. And we have tools available to mitigate those impacts, and we would look to employ them. So we've started to think about that. We're very cognizant of impacts on ratepayers. Anytime a customer's rates are impacted, we need to be aware of those impacts. And so we're thinking about that. That would be part of what we would include in that merger application is the plan of how we would go about combining those rate schedules over time. And we are very cognizant of impacts on individual rate schedules and customers.
And a big piece of that would be what's fair. And those are the, what's just and reasonable and what's fair. And that is, that authority is vested with y'all in rate cases, and nothing about the merger changes that. But as we cite, if we're citing a resource in DEP that ultimately serves all of the broader area, does it make sense to go ahead and allocate that across the system? Those are the types of, and it would in a merge scenario, and that's more about what's fair versus, the perception of one jurisdiction sort of helping another jurisdiction out. We would be focusing on what's fair and equitable based on the resources that we have. And the merger would have to be approved by North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I think there's another host of approvals in various forms when you think about licenses and that kind of thing. So I think the idea of a docket was a good one for stakeholder engagement. But also, we'll have to, I'm sure we'll get into the detail at the right time, but, we have a case to bring before the commission to further explain why that would be in the best interest of South Carolina.
Well, that was kind of the follow-up I was going to ask you, which I think you've answered, is that I'm assuming at whatever point in time, information will be provided that will provide that information that
Yes.
we can ponder, consider, and understand.
Yes, yes. So our intention is to work with stakeholders between now and when we file that merger application in North Carolina, South Carolina, and with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and come to consensus where we can, address some of these issues. And in that merger application, we would provide more details on the merger and exactly what that would mean for customers.
And just for my edification, because I've heard it discussed before, but I don't really know the details relative to the allocation, North Carolina, South Carolina, similar to cost causation classes, such as that rate, is generally allocation looked at or considered that way, cost causation?
Yeah, so right, yes. So we do a cost of service study for both DEP and DEC separately, and we allocate costs based on cost causation. And I've described that in a little bit of detail in my testimony here, and we describe it in more detail in rate cases. But the two utilities use similar methodologies, similar reports, similar allocation methodologies when developing those cost of service studies. And so then as a merged utility, it would be one cost of service study, but using those same methodologies and allocation methodologies and reporting and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And kind of circling back around to, I guess, following up with what Commissioner Vice Chair Williams was asking, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there was a part of me that in one of the responses, it almost seemed like it was P3 or no way, P3 or y'all can be responsible and put it around your neck and let you drown. You didn't say that. Perhaps I shouldn't have taken it that way. So.
And maybe maybe if that was me when I referenced the analogy between heaven and hell, that I do think we have serious concerns about P0, but I don't think it's P3 or no way. I think there are other portfolios, and I think the modeling panel discussed some other portfolios that we have presented in this case that aren't P3 but are not quite P0 either.
Okay. May I ask this? Because this is all I'm interested in, is what I actually, I guess, tried to express yesterday and obviously did a poor job of it. If it's the Commission's role or concern to comply with South Carolina law, and if South Carolina law does not have carbon emission restrictions reduction. And if the utility that provides energy and everything else, South Carolina complies with South Carolina law, why is it an anomaly, or is it incorrect, or is the commission forcing the utility to do something contrary if it's simply, this is the law? Are there portfolios that, comply with that law? Is that an issue?
I think it is, Commissioner.
It is an issue.
I think it's a bit of an issue because I think inherent in your question was because it seemed like inherent in your question there was assumption because South Carolina does not have a target for emissions reduction, that therefore emission reductions are not consistent with South Carolina law.
Yes, ma'am, it pretty much is.
And that is what the South Carolina chapter in my testimony go to, is when you look at the balancing factors, when I look at the balancing factors, diversity of generation supply, that brings in other types of resources that have the effect of reducing carbon emissions. When I look at power supply reliability, that brings in the effect of having lower carbon emissions. When I look at mitigating commodity price risk, particularly as it relates to fuel, that brings in fuel-free resources. So I also look at the other utilities, and if South Carolina had a prohibition on reducing carbon emissions, their portfolios would look a whole lot different. So I think I understand what you're saying, but I don't believe that because there's a target in in North Carolina, that reducing carbon emissions in South Carolina in your IRP is unlawful.
Ms. Smith, I was actually asking Ms. Bateman,
I'm
but
sorry.
I appreciate your response. What I asked, you can consider the balancing factors. That's fine. Does the South Carolina law, current law, the legislation that we're supposed to be following, does it contain carbon emission restrictions or goals?
So it does not, but I think you can get to the same resources with looking at the balancing factors.
I understand that. You well may can. I don't know. All I'm asking, because I don't know. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. Have no desire to tell the company what to do, how to run their business. All I'm asking is, has the company, did the company, will the company, are there portfolios that comply with current South Carolina law relative to that? That's all I'm asking.
And I think, and I'll answer, and I believe Ms. Smith addresses this quite extensively in her testimony, that we believe the P3 fall base is the optimal portfolio for South Carolina customers based solely on South Carolina law and not looking at carbon restrictions. And so what we would point to is what she said about diversity of commodity price risk consideration. And I think we had testimony earlier that P0 would have over 50% of your energy from natural gas. And
may I say this?
Yes.
Pardon for interrupting. I didn't say P0.
Okay.
I'm not suggesting P0.
Okay.
I don't know what it would be called. I don't know what number may exist now. I think I'll ask one more time and then I'll quit. I understand what you're saying. The company believes P3 fall base meets North Carolina law.
Yes.
It meets South Carolina law.
Yes.
I understand that. Is there or should there be a portfolio that does not include carbon emission reductions, which is what one could argue is current South Carolina law. And, you know, whatever is most reliable and least cost, I don't know what those generation sources would be. And I'm not trying to tell you what they should be. I'm simply just asking that. Do you know the answer to that?
Is there a portfolio other than P3 fall base that is compliant with South Carolina law? Is that?
That does not consider carbon emissions reduction.
From the modeling team's perspective of putting that constraint on? Yeah, I don't know.
Models are nothing but constraints and inputs.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I tell you
The suite of portfolios, the suite of options within the IRP filing that doesn't consider carbon constraints is P0.
The only one. Did they run any others other than in that 53? I'll tell you what. Let me just stop here and I think I'll just wrap it up, and then I'll ask maybe ORS. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you both. I appreciate it.
So in South Carolina, the P in IRP doesn't stand for pre-approval or permission, and you're not asking for that?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. Any redirect?
Yes, sir. I have some limited redirect.
Do you know how much? Because it might be a good time for us to take our little morning break, a quick break.
There's no harm in us taking a break, Chair Powers.
Okay, we're going to take 15 minutes. We'll be back at 10 after 12. Is that suitable?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. We are back on the record as to the Duke IRP case. All commissioners are present. All other parties are present, either here or virtually. We are at a point where Duke is now offering redirect testimony of the last panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bateman, got just a few questions for you. You've received some questions, I think yesterday and today, about divergence and resource costs and benefit allocation. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Did you have a similar discussion with the North Carolina Utilities Commission about allocating benefits and costs based upon diverging resource plans?
Yes.
So both commissions are now aware of that dynamic and possibility?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, we've talked some, or the commissioners have talked some, about early site permitting work related to SMRs. I believe most of that was yesterday.
Yes.
And you may or may not know this. I'll ask it and we'll see. Did Georgia Power also complete early site permitting the early site permitting process related to the Vogel plant?
Yes.
And the company's proposed SMRs, that's a much smaller project than Vogel. Is that right? It's smaller in scale?
Yes, it's an iterative process where the reactors are smaller. They are modular. That's the M in SMR, modular. And it's a technology that I think we're hoping will be a way to allow us to deploy nuclear in a more bite-sized application. And when I consider that our nuclear fleet is comprised of 11 units that operate among the best in the country, and the experience that our folks like Mr. Capps have, and how integrated they are with the industry, and that kind of thing, I'm hopeful, and I think we're well positioned to be in that mix, as well as take advantage of opportunities that might come to us through the IRA and other federal dollars that we are chasing. So when I think about that, while the application is new and different, I also think of, nuclear subs are in their own way a form of SMR. So that feels an awful lot like a cousin of what we already have and maintain.
And those early site permitting costs that were discussed yesterday with the commission, those are going to be split with the North Carolina customers based on the retail allocation?
If the North Carolina Commission approves those costs, provided that they're reasonably and prudently incurred, that would provide us coverage on about 80% of those costs. And then, certainly there would be a decision if we also, if we thought they were reasonably and prudently incurred and appropriate for commission consideration. I'm sure at the right time we would bring them forward.
And there was some discussion yesterday with the commission about, and even this morning too, about IRP updates. So the companies are planning to provide additional information about the progress of that early site permitting work with the commission. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And the commission, for example, could include other reporting requirements that it may feel is appropriate in the final order in this proceeding?
Yes.
Would the companies be willing to hold allowable ex parte briefings before this commission to provide even more additional information and to be able to answer questions that the commission may have?
Yes, and while we know that allowable ex parte briefings are not evidence, we do think it is a way for us to bring forward information to the commission in a transparent way, and it provides us an appropriately and publicly noticed way for the commissioners to ask questions. Of course, it's not a record. It's we understand that, but we do appreciate the time and opportunities that we have to bring things like that to the commission, and this would be a good candidate for it.
Thank you. Yesterday, Counsel for ORS asked you about generic unit cost assumptions. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And the parties to this docket, including ORS, could have and presumably did exercise their discovery rights to understand better those generic unit cost assumptions.
Yes, and I think if they also had what I heard and understand is if any party wanted to use different assumptions, there were a variety of parties that have modeling expertise and consultants who have modeling expertise who could have, run those scenarios had they wanted to. And I think there's, a line in the IRP statute that talks about other parties having an opportunity to bring forth alternative plans. And so I don't think we've seen that in this case. I'm not aware of any party bringing forth an alternative plan or scenario to what we've proposed. That information has been out there. We stakeholder engaged on what the modeling input assumptions would be. We provided them at the beginning of the case. We've been very transparent about what those assumptions have been.
Thank you. And I think we've worn this road, but I've got one quick question. So Commissioner Caston yesterday, and I believe Commissioner Thomas this morning, asked about the role of an IRP in a Siting Act proceeding and whether we should recompare the resource in question to other types of resources. Do you remember that?
I do.
Do you agree with the testimony of ORS witness that IRPs are instructive as to resource development and Siting Act proceedings?
Yes.
Thank you. In response to a question from Chair Powers and Commissioner Caston, you confirmed that there's no explicit carbon reduction mandate in South Carolina law. Do you remember that?
Correct.
But the companies did look at South Carolina law, the balancing factors in its evaluation of P3 fall-based, the company's recommended portfolios. Isn't that right?
That is correct. And what I found was that South Carolina policy is chock full of references to clean energy and renewable energy, and those generally denote emissions reductions.
So there are other areas, not only under the IRP statute, but other areas of South Carolina law and policy that support the company's recommended portfolio?
Sure. We really wanted to do a gut check on where else our policymakers had spoken to energy issues, and if any of those places where energy came up in other parts of the South Carolina Code, we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing something, and I feel like we had a pretty comprehensive survey that all pointed to South Carolina having an interest in cleaner energy, which is what we put forth in P3 fall base.
And that comprehensive survey, that's the South Carolina chapter that we filed with the IRP, is that right?
Yes, as further explained in my testimony. And that's the chapter, but also the supplement, because we also applied the same lens to the supplemental analysis filed in January.
That's right. There was a South Carolina supplement, or a supplement to the South Carolina chapter filed in January.
Correct.
And there's nothing in South Carolina law that says utilities should not be mitigating carbon risk. Is that right?
No.
Is that your understanding?
No, in fact, quite the opposite. I think there, when I look at our duty to mitigate commodity price risk, and when I look at the fuel statute that talks about similar concepts, I think there's an expectation that we would consider fuel commodity price risk and what fuel costs are inherent and embedded in the IRP statute, but other areas of South Carolina law.
And ORS itself said in their testimony that P0 did not sufficiently address carbon risk. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Even though there's no law in South Carolina that says we should be accounting for carbon risk explicitly.
Yes, and I think, that's important, especially when I consider the balancing factors of commodity price risk, but also foreseeable conditions, which a lot of our witnesses spoke to in the case.
And you testified previously, too, that other utilities in South Carolina are closing their coal plants?
Yes.
And other utilities are adding substantial new renewable resources to their systems?
Yes.
So would you agree or disagree that we're all moving in roughly the same direction in terms of closing coal plants and adding new renewables to the systems?
Yes, and I think that bears out when I look at, I think this came in earlier as maybe it was the cross exhibit for Mr. Davis, but when I look at the capacity breakdown of us versus the other approved IRPs in South Carolina, we're all, as far as approved IRPs compared to our proposal, we're all looking at, around 30 to 40% of solar in terms of capacity. We're all looking at around, 25 to 36% or so, 31 to 36% or so of natural gas, with a balance of nuclear or renewables, depending upon the system. Santee Cooper does have one coal plant that I think they're assessing, how to replace that energy, so that piece is a little bit different. But when I look at the capacity comparisons in that exhibit that was given to Mr. Davis and the comparison of South Carolina utilities, seems like we're right on trend with P3 fall base.
Right on trend. And ultimately, in this case, the commission must determine whether the IRP is the most reasonable and prudent plan. Isn't that right?
Yes.
There's been conversation about that. And there are alternatives to P3 fall base, the company's recommended portfolio in the record already. Isn't that right?
Yes, I heard Mr. Snyder and Mr. Quinto speak extensively about there was a portfolio, I cannot remember what it was called, but there is or where to find it, but there's a portfolio that excluded offshore wind, and I think they remembered that. I think it's Exhibit 32 right in front of my face. Yes,
Exhibit 32.
There it is, Exhibit 32.
So the commission, in other words, if it decides that P3 fall base, the company's recommended portfolio, is not the most reasonable and prudent plan for South Carolina customers, there are alternatives that it can look at and consider that are already in the evidentiary record in this case.
Correct.
Thank you. Regardless of the decision as to whether to approve P3 fall base, do you remember Mr. Quinto's testimony that the near-term actions in our near-term action plan remain necessary actions and are no regrets moving forward activities?
Yes, I mean the urgency of the activities contained in the near-term action plan remain critical as we think of the resources that we are developing and bringing forth for siting activity. So there are some of those more definitive actions, but also the additional price discovery and evaluations that we're doing on our longer-term options, so that we can test our viability assumptions. Certainly the world looks, we have more definition, I think, around things like SMR. We are continuing to look at Bad Creek, but, of course, the rock that we drilled into several decades ago, that rock's still the same, and we've been operating that facility, very well since that time. But I do recognize the concerns about wind, about offshore wind that have been expressed in this proceeding.
Thank you. And just one last thing. So that the commissioners have been asking about HB 951. They've been asking about the balancing factors in South Carolina. I keep remembering your analogy about the drive from Greenville to Columbia, that there are two different routes. You say in your testimony that two things can be true at once. After thinking about it further and receiving the questions from the commissioners, do you still believe that two things can be true at once?
Yes, I do believe that two things can be true. I do believe that we've put forth a portfolio that is consistent with North Carolina law and South Carolina law, or as I like to say it, consistent with South Carolina law and North Carolina law, just given the chair that I sit in and the state that I live in. But we worked really hard on the homework we were given in the last IRP proceeding to find a path that was executable and something that we thought we could actually do. There's a lot of things that you can pop out in modeling, but that doesn't mean you can do them or that they're consistent with sort of the realities with the system or even with the balancing factors. So when we put forth P3 fall base, it was with both states in mind.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. As far as recross, Sierra Club. Say CCL.
No questions.
Walmart.
No questions.
All right. Clean Energy. Carolina
No questions,
Clean.
Mr. Chair. No questions.
Okay. All right. ORS.
Yes, sir, very briefly. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
Afternoon.
Oh, yes.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Smith, do you recall Mr. Welburn asked you if, with respect to portfolio P0, ORS acknowledged that P0 did not sufficiently address carbon risk?
Yes, I remember that question.
Are you aware if ORS requested that the company provide additional information to the commission about an alternative optimal risk-adjusted P0.
I am aware of that request, and we had indicated, and this is what I was referring to early on in my rebuttal summary, where, as we understand the request, we are happy to work with the ORS, hopefully the consultant as well, and work through what that request looks like, so that we can present that to the commission at some time in the future.
So if Mr. Snyder's testimony indicated that the companies refused to run that additional modeling because it didn't comply with North Carolina law, that would be inaccurate.
Which modeling? The modeling that the ORS requested in its rebuttal testimony, or the new modeling that ORS requested in its rebuttal testimony?
The carbon risk adjusted P0 model.
Is that in the ORS rebuttal, or sorry, is that the one, what was requested in the ORS direct testimony filed in early July, or in the testimony that was filed here a couple weeks ago?
In the ORS direct testimony.
I won't say that we refused to do it per se. That sounds a little bit different than I spoke to, or that Mr. Snyder spoke to. 11 months into the proceeding, we got a modeling request from the ORS, and we did not have the modeling that was requested, nor did we have time to do the modeling that was requested. And then the more we thought about it, the more it didn't make sense for us to do modeling that assumed really that the state of North Carolina didn't exist, or that North Carolina law didn't exist. We would much rather sit down, as both Ms. Bateman and I have described, we would much rather sit down with the ORS and work through these issues and try to find a path to provide a comparison for ORS's, that meets ORS's needs, that might actually represent something we could do in an executable path.
Okay, thanks. So, and just to clarify, there were I think you said there were two reasons the company did not provide the additional modeling that the ORS recommended. One was simply a matter of timing. On that first thing, did the company actually run additional modeling related to compliance with the Clean Air Act Rule 111 after the ORS asked for this additional modeling on P0?
My recollection was that we ran some modeling after the final rule came out, and that we provided that. I remember sitting down and talking to the ORS about that. I remember providing that in the summer, and that's one of the challenges of this case. Our modelers were who are very, very diligent, but they had come to the end of the road on what was doable in this case. There's been, I think there was something like over 400 runs that were done in this case. So I also, would note that the way we think about it is we would have been happy to review any modeling that Mr. Hyatt or any other party had done, given that they had the modeling inputs and modeling capabilities.
And the second reason, and I do want to come back to that timing really brief, but the second reason I believe you said that the companies chose not to do the additional P0 modeling that ORS requested because, quote, it would act as if North Carolina did not exist?
I think I was pretty clear in my rebuttal testimony.
Well, Ms. Smith, I apologize, but I'm not asking about what you said in rebuttal. I'm asking about what you said about 15 seconds ago.
And I would like to clarify my position as to what I said in my rebuttal testimony.
Please.
Given that that's where I discussed the rationale. Yes, we, in my rebuttal testimony, we talked about portfolio P0 not being executable in the company's view, and that it would not, the adoption or consideration of it would not portray an accurate view of South Carolina's law and policy, and that we do have to account for laws applicable to the company's resource planning and execution activities. Also, we know enough about P0 to know that what came out of that does not meet the balancing factors in South Carolina. I also am I'm concerned that in looking at South Carolina law, and an IRP absolutely has to be decided upon the basis of South Carolina law, but we also do have to acknowledge the facts that a lot of our assets are located in North Carolina, and this is the exact complexity and challenge why we think it would be better to sit down with the ORS and hopefully Mr. Hyatt, should he continue to be retained by ORS, and work through those complexities. When Mr. Hyatt was talking about working with multi-state utilities and working through the constraints that may be present in each of those different states, that sounded like a very positive thing, and we would certainly love to have more conversations about that.
Thanks, Ms. Smith. And wrapping up here, do you believe it's important for this commission to have a fulsome record before it in deciding whether to approve, modify, or deny this IRP?
I do, and I think the 400 runs and the 13 months of this proceeding and the multiple rounds of testimony provide that.
Okay, but P0 is a no carbon plan, is that correct?
P0 is not a plan in my mind. P0 was a portfolio that was required to be run with no carbon constraints. And once you require a portfolio like that to be run, it cuts you out of a lot of the things that we're supposed to consider when we look at commodity price risk, reliability, resource availability, foreseeable conditions, and the balance of South Carolina law and policy that is pointing us toward cleaner energy.
P0, risk adjusted for carbon, as ORS asked, would provide this commission with an idea of what a portfolio would look like if North Carolina law
Objection,
did not
Mr.
exist.
Chair. Counsel is testifying.
Would you agree that P0 adjusted for carbon, as the ORS requested, would provide this commission with an idea of what a South Carolina IRP would look like?
No, I don't agree with that. There's a couple of things to unpack there. First of all, if we're going to use carbon constraints, it makes sense to me to use the ones that we actually have versus a fictional carbon constraint. It makes sense to go with what we know. That was number one. Number two, if ORS believes that that would be a good portfolio, I don't understand why ORS didn't run that portfolio, given that it had all of our information and the statute looks to parties to bring forth alternative plans. Number three, the company is supposed to bring forth what it believes to be the most reasonable and prudent plan, along with the other statutory factors that are included in Act 62, and I believe that we met that burden. So I'm sorry, I just can't agree with the fundamental premise of your question, but if ORS does really believe that, I think we'd be happy to look at that analysis. But there's nothing in Act 62 that requires us, as I read it, to do modeling that other parties could do.
Would you agree that ORS first asked the company to provide a let me back up. You said P0 is not a model.
I think you're mincing my words a little bit. I think you talked about that it would be a plan
Okay,
that South Carolina could consider.
You said P0 is not a plan.
Yes.
And that's because the company didn't treat P0 seriously like it treated P1, P2, P3, right?
Oh, it absolutely did. The commission ordered us to run a no carbon constraints model, and I didn't have to push too hard for that. Of course, our modelers were on top of complying with the order, but we had a lot of conversations about whether we thought we were meeting the spirit and intent of the commission's order, and we did. But the fact that there was a portfolio run does not obligate the company to put it forth as something that we think is in the interest of South Carolina customers, or that that would be a good option for South Carolina to consider. I will admit we did not put it on the same page as the other pathways, but it was in the IRP. It was not hidden. We did the work. Our modelers did the work, and we think we did what we were asked to by the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have.
Mr. Chair, I have a factual issue on redirect. If you'll allow me to do it, it would be like 15 seconds. Up to you, your call, but it was a factual issue that I think the record would be improved by clarifying.
Well, I think you can bring it out through ORS questions.
We can do that. Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Anything else for this panel? Thank you both very much. You've been sitting there for a long time, and we would excuse you this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, the companies rest their case.
Thank you very much. ORS.
Thank you, Chair Powers. ORS would call Ms. Leah Welburn to the stand. She'll be appearing virtually. Ms. Welburn, are you with us today?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
I can now.
Okay. Would you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You're a witness.
Thank you. Ms. Welburn, just for the record, could you please restate your name?
Leah Wellborn.
Okay. And Ms. Welburn, did you prepare or cause to be prepared 20 pages of pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony in these dockets on August 30th, 2024?
I did.
Do you have any changes, edits, or corrections to your pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
If I ask you those same questions today as those posed in your pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'd move that the pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony of Ms. Welburn be read into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony of Ms. Welborn will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you. Ms. Welburn, did you also pre-file with your sir rebuttal testimony one exhibit marked Sir Rebuttal Exhibit LJW-1?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or edits or corrections to that exhibit?
No, I do not.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Ms. Welburn's Sir Rebuttal Exhibit LJW-1 be marked for identification and entered into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
The pre-filed exhibit of witness Welborn identified as LJW-1 It's marked for identification, will be placed in the record as exhibit number 33.
Thank you. Ms. Walburn, did you prepare a summary of your pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony?
Yes,
Would you please present that at this time?
of course. Good afternoon, Commissioners. The purpose of my direct testimony was to provide additional context and support for 8 recommendations that were identified in the ORS report. My direct testimony addressed the company's load forecast, DSM sensitivities, commodity forecasts, renewable energy modeling, and Encompass benchmarking. The companies responded in rebuttal, agreeing with 6 of my recommendations, and the purpose of my sir rebuttal testimony was to respond to the company's witnesses' rebuttal testimony and to discuss the resolution of each recommendation. I'll provide a brief summary of the 6 resolved recommendations, followed by a summary of the 2 unresolved recommendations I addressed in my testimony. Recommendation B1 relates to the ongoing monitoring of economic development load and the tracking of the new economic development project pipeline. ORS recommended annual reporting related to customer project demand and energy requirements and an analysis of the changes in the forecast. Duke Energy agreed to providing updates annually, including the production of confidential work papers to ORS, resolving ORS's recommendation. Recommendation B2 relates to energy and demand forecasts. ORS recommended Duke Energy discuss its load forecasting methodology, including economic development load, electric vehicle load, and behind-the-meter solar photovoltaic load in the stakeholder working group. ORS also recommended Duke Energy evaluate its methodology to produce a reasonable range of forecast sensitivities over the short term and long term. Duke Energy agreed to discuss load forecasting in the stakeholder working group, resolving ORS's recommendation. Recommendation D1 relates to the forecasting of hydrogen availability, blending, and pricing, given the early stages of the industry and supply chain. ORS recommended Duke Energy discuss hydrogen assumptions in the stakeholder working group, and Duke Energy agreed to further evaluate and discuss these topics, resolving ORS's recommendation. Recommendation E1 relates to renewable energy effective load carrying capability, or ELCC modeling. ORS recommended Duke Energy revise its ELCC modeling in the 2025 IRP update and to discuss improvements to ELCC modeling in the stakeholder working group. Duke Energy agreed to do the revision and to discuss changes in modeling as software capabilities change, resolving ORS's recommendation. Recommendation E3 relates to federal incentives and the possible energy infrastructure reinvestment loan program opportunities. ORS recommended Duke Energy discuss updates related to these opportunities and incorporate any modeling adjustments into the 2025 IRP update. Duke Energy acknowledged its ongoing efforts in reporting and agreed to update if new information became available. As such, ORS considers recommendation E3 resolved. However, ORS reiterates the time-sensitive nature of the investigation and recommends Duke Energy discuss EIR financing in the stakeholder working group ahead of the 2025 IRP update. Recommendation E4 relates to modeling of the Clean Air Act Section 111 sensitivities presented in the IRP. ORS recommended additional modeling be provided in the 2025 IRP update consistent with the final rule. Duke Energy presented modeling in rebuttal testimony consistent with the Supplemental Planning Analysis, SPA, cases and determined that compliance with Clean Air Act was not feasible with the SPA P3 fall-based portfolio construction, assuming a 2035 interim CO2 compliance target consistent with North Carolina statute. Duke Energy Witness Quinto Rebuttal Exhibit 1 contained a summary of the Clean Air Act modeling evaluation conducted, concluding that the SPA P3 fall-based portfolio required nearly all available carbon-free resources be cumulatively available by 2035 to achieve the interim target in that year, and that if additional resources cannot be added to the system to achieve the emissions reductions in a rapidly growing load environment, the interim target would necessarily be required to be delayed. Duke demonstrated this behavior and modeled a portfolio compliance case with limited offshore wind availability and a 2038 interim target for CO2 emissions. This 2038 no offshore wind case resulted in a lower present value revenue requirement, PVRR, than the SPA P3 fall base case. ORS witness Hayat discusses the implication of this modeling and ORS's revision to recommendation F5. In relation to recommendation E4, Duke Energy provided information in this proceeding and agreed to provide updated sensitivity modeling in the 2025 IRP update relating to Clean Air Act, thus adequately resolving ORS's recommendation E4. The two recommendations that remain unresolved are E2 and G1. Recommendation E2 relates to Duke Energy's modeling of solar resources. ORS recommends Duke Energy comply with Commission Order 2023-189 to model both company-owned and power purchase agreement solar as selectable resource options and not arbitrarily limit the selection of PPA solar resources in the 2025 IRP update. Duke Energy's rebuttal testimony noted that multiple resource options in Encompass are redundant and that the procurement process would be the place to consider ownership structures. ORS remains concerned that Duke Energy is not modeling the most economic representation of the resource. Further, in supplying the single portfolio case with solar modeled as PPAs, ORS remains concerned that Duke Energy did not meet the requirements of the order. ORS considers recommendation E2 unresolved. And finally, in recommendation G1, ORS recommended Duke Energy be required to conduct production cost model benchmark studies on an ongoing basis, such as once every 3 years ahead of comprehensive IRP proceedings, and report the results in the stakeholder working group. Duke Energy's rebuttal testimony addressed the recommendation, arguing the exercise provides little value while adding additional burden to the comprehensive IRP process. ORS reiterates that benchmarking is consistent with current IRP expectations for Dominion Energy South Carolina, and benchmarking is performed periodically as an industry practice. As the composition of the grid changes over time, benchmarking efforts provide assurance that the modeling assumptions accurately reflect real-time operations, providing value to the process. ORS continues to recommend benchmarking be conducted regularly and considers recommendation G1 unresolved. And this concludes my summary.
Thank you, Ms. Welborn. Chair Powers, Ms. Welborn is available for cross and commissioner questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Duke, Mr. Brightford.
Good afternoon, Ms. Welborn. Can you see me okay?
Yes, good afternoon.
Nice to see you again. Hope you're doing well. Again, I'm Brett Braceward on behalf of the companies. I've got a couple questions for you today on your rebuttal testimony. I'd like to start off with your analysis under the Clean Air Act regulations, the final rule, section 111, around page 10. This is recommendation E4.
Sure.
And I think you said that this recommendation was resolved through the supplemental modeling that the companies prepared in your summary earlier.
Yes, so recommendation E4 expected that additional modeling would be ongoing by the companies to address Clean Air Act modeling, and that additional modeling would be presented to the commission in the 2025 IRP update. We got a preview of it in the rebuttal testimony provided by Quinto, but the company is also committed to providing additional information in the 2025 IRP update, which was ORS's recommendation E4.
Thank you. And you are the subject matter expert for ORS on the Clean Air Act final rule?
I am addressing those issues in my testimony. That's right.
Thank you. And you would agree that the new rule is a binding regulation on the company's operations, specifically with existing coal-fired power plants and new natural gas generation?
I think we acknowledge that that's the law of the land. Expecting probably legal challenge, but it is currently an expectation that exists for the future.
Understood, and I agree with you. It's currently being appealed, but is currently the law of the land, as you said. And I think you were referencing Miss Smith's testimony in making that comment yours. So just to confirm, then, if this is a regulation that's binding on Duke's operation, then you would agree that it fits within the balancing factor compliance with applicable state and federal environmental regulations?
It definitely could and should be a part of the evaluation. As we've talked about a lot, the ultimate weighing of those factors will be, to the commission, but having that information available is very important.
Fair enough. And moving along, you were the primary reviewer of Mr. Quinto's Clean Air Act 111 sensitivity analysis that he filed as his rebuttal Exhibit 1, correct?
I did review it. I'll admit it was limited given the time we had between receiving it and then having to produce a rebuttal, but yes, I am happy to discuss the exhibit.
Great, thank you. And so I know you said as of August 30th that ORS conducted a limited review of this updated modeling in your rebuttal testimony. Did you have an opportunity between August 30th and present to further evaluate the company's Clean Air Act 111 sensitivity analysis?
Not to the extent that any of the opinions have changed.
Okay. But you would say you're relatively familiar with it, or very familiar. You've had sufficient time to review it. Is that accurate?
I don't know if I would say that it's fully articulated, but we have reviewed it to the extent that we believe it's indicating certain trends that we do expect to be consistent with final compliance.
Okay.
So
that's fair. And were you able to hear your counsel's discussion with Mr. Quinto on that modeling that occurred last Friday afternoon?
yes.
Okay, very good. Specific to that discussion, are you also familiar with what has been entered in the record as hearing Exhibit 32?
I believe, yes, I am. And I will also say this is a very similar story as to what I've presented in Rebuttal Exhibit LJW1. So yes, I'm familiar with this exhibit.
Good. And just to confirm, based on your review of what the company's presented here in this exhibit, it's accurate and consistent with the company's with Mr. Quinto's Rebuttal Exhibit 1 and the Clean Air Act sensitivity analysis modeling now is performed.
I believe it's consistent with the exhibit, yes.
Okay. And the results of that portfolio analysis was performed in the same manner as the comprehensive modeling process the companies undertook in preparing the plan. Would you agree with that?
Yes, as I understand it, the assumptions are very similar, with the exceptions that have been outlined, to meet the Clean Air Act compliance.
Thank you. And so just to confirm, based on your review of this analysis, and I think I had this conversation with Mr. Schneider and Mr. Quinto yesterday, but the major difference is the addition of offshore wind, whether it's needed in P3 fall base, whether it's reduced in the 2037 case or delayed beyond the base planning period in that 2038 case. Is that accurate?
I think that's what we're seeing with these two cases. I don't know if that's the only conclusion you would draw. When I look at the difference between the P3 fall base and the Clean Air Act 2038 no offshore wind, you do see that trade-off of offshore wind selection with a slight increase in solar and batteries in the near term. And so to say that there wouldn't be other portfolios that would show other things, I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question. Maybe you could ask it again. I apologize.
Sure. No, well, let me just start out. You would agree that the presentation here is generally consistent across solar, wind, nuclear, combined cycles, combustion turbines, and batteries, and the need for pump storage hydro. I'm sorry, but the need for pump storage hydro at Bad Creek as well.
Through 2038, these portfolios do have that level of resources.
Thank you. And there was also some discussion with Mr. Quinto on Friday about across the various portfolios that were considered in the Clean Air Act 111 sensitivity analysis and whether there was a confirmed need for the resources identified by this modeling in the company's near-term action plan. Do you recall those questions from ORS Council on Friday afternoon?
I do.
And so with the exception of, or let me ask you, have you had a chance to review, this is page 15 of the exhibit. This is, I guess, table SA7 to simplify it. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. And the information presented there based on your review of the company's modeling, would you say it's accurate?
Yeah, I think the company's position is that to meet a P3 fall-based 2035 emissions reduction or a 2038 emissions reduction, these are the resources that are identified.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's necessarily consistent that every portfolio that could be created would require those same resources, but that is definitely what the conclusion with these two comparisons is indicating.
Thank you, Ms. Welborn. So based on this analysis that was presented by Mr. Quinto, it confirms the need across the Clean Air Act 111 compliant portfolios for each of the resources in the near-term action plan, with the exception of offshore wind, which it identifies as potential flexibility to delay. Agree with that?
Yes, assuming an interim compliance with North Carolina of the emissions 2035 or 2038, those resources are identified.
Thank you. And did you hear the discussion yesterday with Mr. Stillman related to the economic development load forecast?
Yes.
And that's something that you addressed in your testimony as well?
That's correct.
And so we walked through figure 1 with Mr. Stillman yesterday afternoon. Do you recall that?
Mm-hmm.
And last Wednesday, I think when we were speaking, we discussed the significant, I think you identified in your testimony, 1,000 megawatt increase to the load forecast by 2028. That's resulting from a number of factors, but predominantly the economic development load forecast increase. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay. And would you agree that are you familiar with the analysis he prepared to present this figure 1? I'm essentially assessing whether you agree with the way this is presented and the conclusions that we went through with Mr. Stillman yesterday.
I do, to the extent that I believe the dotted lines are showing the economic development load at 100%, and the economic development load in the forecast is at a discount. I think I'm understanding that. I think we are also seeing that the June forecast, the more recent forecast, is showing a near-term decrease in that load expectation compared to the long-term expectation. And so that's how I've been interpreting figure 1.
Thank you.
And I think that's consistent with Stillman rebuttal exhibit 1 as well.
That's correct. And that was where I was going to go next. And so through your review of that more detailed rebuttal exhibit 1, it validates the analysis that's presented in this figure 1. Is that accurate?
I have no reason to doubt it. I'm not sure I've received the work paper, so I don't want to speak definitively to that. But the work paper or the exhibit itself does demonstrate this behavior. Okay, fair enough. And okay, I think I can move on from there. Thank you. So if you could turn to page 6 of your testimony, please. My sir rebuttal?
Yes, ma'am. And this relates to the one of the 2 remaining controverted issues you identified in your testimony related to modeling of solar PPAs that you and Mr. Quinto still seem to not be fully aligned on. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, great. So were you able to hear Mr. Quinto's testimony on Friday explaining the difference between the deferred economic carrying charge approach to modeling resources versus a levelized cost of energy approach to modeling resources?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And would you agree with Mr. Quinto that all model selectable resources included in the IRP are based on standardized generic resource assumption using this deferred economic carrying charge approach?
Yes, that is the approach used in the modeling.
Okay, and so there are no other technologies where ORS is recommending Duke model a separate duplicate levelized cost of energy approach similar to what has been identified for solar resources. Is that accurate? For combustion? Go ahead.
That's true. This recommendation is following the commission ordered requirements. So that's, I think, a key consideration here. I think in the past there's been a difference in what PPA pricing has been compared to what may have been modeled in the company-owned economic carrying charge methodology.
Okay, and I want to pull on that thread a little bit. So on page 7, line 17 of your testimony, you referenced that PPA solar may be able to take advantage of lower financing cost. And I think there was a conversation with Mr. Quinto about in the 2020 IRP, there was reference to a $38 solar PPA option that was available. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay, and we'd all agree that there's not it would be great for customers, but today there's not a $38 PPA option that is available in the company service territory. That's not what the market price of solar is today. Is that fair?
That's true, and I will tread very lightly on confidentiality. ORS table 27, I think, does show a snapshot of what was being offered in the 2022 solicitation. So if anyone has those confidential numbers, they can sort of see where things are looking today.
Thank you. And there's no real dispute between the companies and the ORS about what or between the companies in your report about what the called the reasonable price or the range of prices of solar resources are today based on the most recent procurements. That you've investigated that data provided by the companies and found it to be reasonable in the way it's presented in the modeling. Is that accurate?
We have. We've reviewed it both in that table 27 perspective and also in our appendix B, where we sort of compare to market. I think we noted that it may be a little on the high side, but still consistent with market pricing.
Thank you. And so between the 2020 IRP and now, would you agree that there has been a significant change in circumstances with the enactment of the IRA where both utility-owned solar, which is a change, as well as third-party solar can now access tax credits to reduce the cost of solar for customers?
I'm not sure if there's a change in utilities versus the developers, but yes, the IRA has allowed for all of the parties to access IRA incentive money.
Okay, and if you know, is that a consideration that's changed that would impact the driving reason why the ORS and the Commission and the 2020 IRP proceeding was focused on evaluating this third-party PPA option, because there was the perception or reality at the time that it was materially cheaper for customers because third-party developers could access those tax credits and the utility could not?
I would agree that that was a consideration, that PPA pricing was seemingly more economic than the company-owned pricing.
Thank you. And so that's a changed circumstance now that the companies can also access and utilize those tax credits for the benefit of customers in the same way as third-party developers. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think there's still a relative difference, possibly just not to get into all the nitty-gritties, but the weighted average cost of capital, financing options, based on that procurement that we discussed in ORS Table 27, there may still be a slight difference, but the prices are coming together.
Okay, thank you. And so And you would agree with Mr. Quinto's testimony that there's a range of real-world PPA and utility-owned costs of solar projects that are procured by the utility, and that cost will change over time, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so do you know, ballpark, how much solar is identified as needed in the company's recommended portfolio P3 fall base?
I do, and it is near the maximum available amount in the near term. I think we've got a table in the report that shows sort of that difference in procurements on solar that's identified between all the cases. It compares P0, P1, P2, P3, and P3 is selecting a significant amount of what's available.
Thank you. Ballpark 17,000 megawatts over the full 15-year base planning period.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And would you agree with me that recognizing that there are differences in pricing over time and this significant volume of solar that is being selected in the model, that it's more reasonable for Duke to model a single solar resource and to continue to do price sensitivity analysis to assess the cost of these resources in the future versus trying to peg a single PPA price for the total solar availability over that full 15-year period?
Yes and no, and maybe I can elaborate because my rebuttal testimony on page 7, it says, there's a compliance issue, number 1, and the companies do not appear to be requesting relief from the commission's modeling requirement. And if Duke had made such a request, it may have been appropriate to model a single generic variation of solar resources from a modeling efficiency perspective. And if that's the case, even so, that resource should be the least cost variation. And I think it's important. Thank you so much. I think that's an important consideration because we do have possible other portfolio constructions that don't select up to the maximum. And so if you are considering, from a methodology perspective, you want the least cost version, but there is an efficiency to modeling a single generic resource. I guess I'm just not sure why, if Duke Energy believes this too, why the request for relief wasn't made.
That is an excellent question, and this may be a blame it on the lawyers point in time, but is this something that you would agree that the companies in ORS could engage on in advance of the next IRP, and if appropriate, and the companies could request relief from this recommendation at that time?
I won't speak for ORS if you got a chance to talk with Mr. Salter later, but I think it is reasonable to consider the modeling efficiency. We're just very cognizant that there has been a difference between PPA solar pricing and company-owned pricing, and so to the extent that there is a most economic version, we would want that captured if possible.
That's fair enough. Thank you very much. Turning now to the one other issue that you and Mr. Quinto aren't fully aligned on yet, but still optimistic, is this benchmarking recommendation that you identified in your testimony at page 18. This is recommendation G1.
Yes.
Okay. And did you hear Mr. Quinto's testimony on the issue?
I did.
Okay. And his response was that this is burdensome and of limited value to assessing future system conditions. Did you hear that?
I did.
And then Mr. Snyder also highlighted that there are differences between the way the IRP is developed using weather normalized data, while real-world system operations that would be used for benchmarking are not weather normalized. Is that an accurate characterization of that difference?
It is, and I think it's probably helpful to put into perspective that in a benchmark activity, you would be looking at the actual loads historically to do that effort. And so, yes, it's not precisely the same as what would be used in a forecast, but the benchmarking exercise itself is testing whether the dispatch in actuality can be replicated to a dispatch in the model.
Okay. And you also highlight in your testimony that this is a requirement that Dominion here in South Carolina is now implementing. Is that the result of an ORS recommendation and a prior commission IRP order?
Yes.
And so just because it was directed for Dominion doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate or should be required for Duke. Is that fair?
That may be fair, but I think what we're trying to demonstrate here is that it is something utilities are willing and able to do. And that if it's providing value for Dominion and identifying possible adjustments to their modeling or to stakeholders in that process, that it may also provide those same benefits for a system as large as Duke Energy's and a system that is as fundamentally changing as Duke Energy's. We've been hearing that we're going to be potentially dispatching to meet Clean Air Act requirements. We may be having to dispatch differently to meet North Carolina carbon reductions. We may be implementing significantly more solar. And so having these efforts conducted provides value to the process.
Thank you for that. And do you know how many generating units Dominion operates?
I don't have a specific number, but it's much less than Duke Energy's.
Okay, and so if you reviewed Appendix B to the Duke IRP, subject to check, it would identify that the company operates a portfolio of approximately 175 separate generating units. Would you accept that?
Subject to check.
And so integrating the outage data for those 175 units would be a significantly more time-consuming and burdensome task than the more limited number of generating units, probably a few dozen that Dominion operates. Is that fair?
Yes.
And what other variables would the companies have to gather data and then evaluate, go through a modeling benchmark process to complete the tasks that you recommended the commission direct?
Right. So you're looking at the outages that have happened. You're looking at the actual fuel costs and availability. You're looking at the actual load that has happened. And any sort of system constraints that may be relevant to capturing. And those are exactly the things that stakeholders likely want to know, is if the constraints that are being used in real-time operations for fuel, for outages, if those types of constraints are able to be modeled in the production cost studies so that we get a match, that there's accuracy being put forward.
Thank you. And have you prepared one of these benchmark studies before?
I have not performed a historic benchmark study, but I've benchmarked model to model before, and I do not dispute that it is a significant amount of effort. But I've reviewed benchmarking studies, and it's happening in the industry regularly.
Okay, and I think you identified two utilities, Dominion and then another utility in Utah, I believe, where this is occurring. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And how many hours do you expect this process of gathering data, running the benchmark analysis, QCing the data to ensure it's accurate and gives the right outputs in the benchmarking assessment, and then preparing this benchmarking study? How long do you think that could take or should take for Duke Energy?
I don't have an idea. I understand from Mr. Quinto's testimony that there is ongoing benchmarking activities being performed. I don't know if those are being done with historic snapshots or if they're being done for a month's worth of data, a year's worth of data, if they're only being done on a forecast basis. So I don't know what the incremental effort would be, but I think there is some value in discussing what that cost benefit is.
Okay. And I think when we spoke last Wednesday, you had identified that you had read Appendix C quantitative analysis to the original plan.
Yes.
And that was, Mr. Quinto drafted that. It's 113 pages. And so I guess I'm just establishing that we would agree he's a pretty detail-oriented guy.
That may be fair.
And he put a lot of time and effort into that. So when he's identifying these concerns, I think it's, would you agree that it's meaningful and it's something that if the company believes this is an extremely burdensome recommendation of limited value and you don't know how long it would take to do this benchmarking analysis, would it make sense for Duke and the ORS to discuss this further and make sure we get on the same page before the commission imposes this type of technical study requirement for the next IRP? Is this something that could be engaged on stakeholder working group to assess how burdensome this would be and if there's a more refined scope before the next comprehensive IRP?
I think more discussion would be welcome and possibly provide better insights to this commission to review whether or not the commission still deems that a requirement is necessary. We'll have to defer. But additional discussions to help maybe bring the scope in could be helpful, sure.
Thank you, Ms. Welborn. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Before we continue with cross-examination, we have a briefing we have to attend and lunch. I'm going to say it's 1:20. If we could be back at 2:30, would that be enough time? Commissioners? Thank you. Okay, we'll recess till 2:30.